I didn't know why the most dangerous man in the city was staring at me like he already owned my silence before I ever spoke a word. The first thing I noticed wasn't him. Not really. It was the room bending around his presence. The way conversations softened without stopping. The way laughter dropped half a note like people suddenly remembered something they couldn't explain. And I kept my head down because that's what you do when you don't belong somewhere. You stay quiet. You move fast. You don't get noticed. Especially not in a place where a single watch on someone's wrist probably cost more than my rent for a year. And yet somehow my hands still trembled as I balanced the tray, crystal glasses chiming softly with each step, a fragile kind of music that felt too loud against the weight in the air. I told myself it was just another shift, just another upscale event where I didn't fit, just another night pretending I understood the rules of a world built on money and power. But then I felt it, that shift. That invisible line crossing, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees without anyone turning down the air. And when I looked up, just for a second, just long enough to make a mistake, I saw him. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't speaking. He wasn't even moving. But everything around him moved differently, like orbiting something they couldn't touch, and his eyes found mine in a way that made my chest tighten. Not fear exactly. Not yet. Something deeper. Something that made it hard to breathe because it felt familiar in the wrong way, like remembering a dream you weren't supposed to have. I looked away immediately because that's what instinct screamed at me to do: break eye contact, disappear, go back to being invisible. But it was already too late. I could feel it in the way my pulse picked up, in the way my fingers tightened around the tray, in the way the room suddenly felt too small, even though it stretched wide with marble floors and golden light. Somewhere behind me, someone whispered his name, low, careful, like it carried weight, Adrian Volkov. And I didn't know who he was, but I knew what he was. Power doesn't need introductions, it announces itself in silence. I took another step, then another, telling myself to keep moving, to finish the job, to leave before anything could go wrong. But my foot caught the edge of the carpet, just slightly, just enough, and the tray tilted, glasses sliding. The sound sharp and sudden as one tipped and shattered against the floor, and for a moment everything stopped. Not the music, not the people, just me, just him, just that invisible line pulling tight between us. I crouched down quickly, heart racing, hands moving to gather the broken pieces, whispering apologies that no one really heard. But I could feel it, that weight again, heavier now, closer, and I didn't need to look up to know he was watching. I could feel his attention like a hand resting just short of touching, controlled, deliberate, restrained. Footsteps approached, slow, measured, expensive shoes against polished stone, and the noise of the room seemed to fade into something distant, something unreal, until all I could hear was my own breathing and the faint echo of glass under my fingertips. Then a voice, low, calm, the kind that didn't need to be loud to be obeyed, cut through everything. Bring her to me. And just like that, I understood something without knowing why. This night wasn't ordinary, and I wasn't invisible anymore. Two men reached me before I could stand, not grabbing, not rough, just there, one on each side like walls that moved when I did. And that somehow felt worse because it was controlled, practiced, like this had happened 100 times before and never once gone wrong. And I swallowed the instinct to pull away because something told me that would only make everything harder. So I let them guide me across the room, past the soft music and quiet conversations that pretended not to notice, past eyes that looked and then quickly looked away, until the air changed again, heavier, colder, sharper, and I knew without looking that he was close. I stopped when they stopped, my hands still slightly shaking, my pulse too loud in my ears, and for a second no one said anything. Not him, not me, just silence stretching thin between us like it might break if either of us breathed too hard. Then I felt it, his attention, not drifting, not curious, fixed, like he had already decided something and was just waiting for the world to catch up. I lifted my eyes slowly, careful, and met his gaze fully this time, and it hit differently up close, not just intensity, not just power, something colder, more precise, like he was not seeing me for the first time, but recognizing something he had been looking for without knowing it. He did not speak right away, and that silence pressed in, made the room feel smaller, made it harder to think, until finally he took one step closer, measured, unhurried, and said, "What is your name?" Not asked, not exactly, more like a fact he expected to be given, and my voice almost failed me before it came out quiet but steady. "Lily." He repeated it once, softer, like testing it, like it meant something more than it should, and his eyes did not leave mine. "Lily," he said again, and something in the way he said it made my chest tighten, like the sound of it belonged to a memory I did not have. I forced myself to hold his gaze, to not shrink, to not disappear, because I had learned that sometimes silence was the only thing you could control, and he seemed to notice that, the lack of fear, or maybe the refusal to show it, because his expression shifted just slightly, not softer, not kinder, just different, like I had broken a pattern he was used to. "You should not be here," he said, and I almost laughed because of course I should not. That was obvious. But the way he said it made it sound like something else entirely, like I had crossed into a place that was not meant for me, and now there was no simple way out. "I work here," I replied, and my voice felt steadier than I expected, which surprised me more than anything, and for a second something flickered in his eyes, brief, unreadable, gone before I could understand it. He looked at my hands then, at the small cut near my fingers from the broken glass, and his jaw tightened just enough that I noticed, just enough that it did not feel accidental. "You are bleeding," he said, and it was not concern, not exactly, more like observation, but the way his gaze stayed there a second too long made it feel heavier than it should have. "It is nothing," I answered quickly, pulling my hand back, instinctively, like I needed to reclaim something that had never been his to begin with. And that was when the room shifted again, subtle but real, like I had stepped into a line I did not understand. He exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, and for the first time since I had seen him, there was something restrained in the way he moved, like he was holding himself back from something even he did not fully control. "Nothing," he repeated, but it sounded different when he said it, like he did not believe me, like he did not accept simple answers. Then he straightened slightly, the moment folding back into something colder, more controlled, and when he spoke again, his voice carried that same quiet authority that had pulled me across the room in the first place. "You will come with me." Not a threat, not a question, just certainty. And in that second, standing under the weight of his gaze, I realized something that made my pulse spike all over again. He was not asking for my name anymore. He had already decided what I was to him, and I had no idea why. For a second I did not move because the words did not feel real. They felt like something said in a different language even though I understood every syllable, and the space between us tightened as if the room itself was waiting for my answer. But I had learned something long before tonight. Sometimes the only way to keep yourself from being swallowed by someone else's world is to refuse to step into it. So I shook my head, small but deliberate, and said, "No." The word barely left my lips. Quiet, steady, but it landed heavier than anything else that had been said all night, and I saw at the instant it reached him, not anger, not surprise, something sharper, like I had interrupted a certainty he had never questioned. No one around us moved, no one spoke, but I could feel the shift ripple outward, subtle, controlled, like the air had changed direction, and his gaze did not leave mine, not even for a second, as if he was trying to understand what had just happened, not the word itself, but the fact that I had said it. "No," he repeated, softer this time, like he was testing it the same way he had tested my name. And there was something almost curious in the way he said it, something that did not match the weight of the man standing in front of me. I swallowed, my heart beating too fast now, but I did not look away, I did not step back, because something told me that if I did, I would lose whatever fragile ground I had managed to hold. "I have work," I added, and it sounded simple, almost ridiculous in a place like this, but it was the only truth I had, the only thing that still belonged to me. For a moment, nothing happened, and that silence stretched again, thinner this time, sharper, until he exhaled slowly, almost like he was forcing himself to slow down, to step back from something even he did not expect. He looked at me differently then, not just seeing me, but measuring something, recalculating, and I realized with a sudden clarity that this was new for him. This moment, this resistance, this lack of fear, or maybe just the absence of submission, and it unsettled him in a way that did not show on the surface but pressed through in the smallest details, the slight tightening of his jaw, the stillness in his shoulders, the The way his fingers flexed once at his side before going still again. Everyone has work, he said finally, his voice calm again, controlled. But there was something under it now, something quieter, more dangerous because it was restrained, not unleashed, and everyone can leave it. I shook my head again, this time more certain, and said, I cannot, because that was the truth, not just about the job, but about everything, about the life I had built piece by piece in a city that never noticed people like me unless they caused trouble. His eyes dropped to my face, studying, searching, and for a second I wondered what he saw. Not a waitress, not just a girl who did not belong here, but something else, something I did not understand. Then he stepped closer, just one step, but it closed the distance enough that I could feel the difference in the air between us. Warmer, sharper, heavier, and my breath caught before I could stop it. You think this is a choice, he said, not unkind, not harsh, just certain, and that certainty sent something cold down my spine because it sounded like he was not speaking about tonight anymore. Not about the job, not about the room, but about something bigger, something I could not see yet. I forced myself to stay where I was, to not step back, to not give in to the instinct that told me to run, because running would not change anything, not with someone like him. It is, I replied, even though my voice was quieter now, even though my pulse was louder than ever, and for the first time, something in his expression shifted into something almost unreadable, not control, not power, something closer to conflict, like I had said something that did not fit into the world he understood. He looked at me for a long second, then two, then three, and the room faded again, the noise, the people, everything disappearing until it was just us standing in the space between two decisions that neither of us had fully made yet. Then he straightened slightly, the moment folding back into something colder again, something more familiar to him. And when he spoke, his voice carried that same quiet command, but now there was something else layered beneath it, something I could not name. Then finish your work, he said, stepping back just enough to break the tension without releasing it completely. And do not leave. And just like that, I understood something that made my chest tighten all over again. This was not over. It had only just begun. I tried to move like nothing had changed, like the world had not tilted slightly off balance. But every step felt different now, heavier, as if the floor beneath me carried the memory of his voice, and I could still feel his gaze even after he had stepped away, like something unseen following me through the room, steady, patient, waiting. I bent down to gather a fresh tray, my fingers more careful this time, slower, as if control could be rebuilt through small movements, and I told myself to focus on the routine, the simple rhythm of work, pick up, walk, serve, repeat, because routine meant safety, and safety meant distance, and distance was the only thing that might still belong to me. But it was not the same anymore, because every sound felt sharper, every glance heavier, and I could not stop the quiet awareness that had settled in my chest, the certainty that somewhere across the room, he was still watching. I did not look for him, not at first. I refused to give that part of me anything to hold on to, but awareness does not need sight. It builds itself in the spaces between moments, in the way conversations seemed to shift when I passed, in the way a man in a dark suit stepped slightly closer when I moved toward the edge of the room, not blocking, not stopping, just there, like a reminder. I carried drinks to a table near the window, the city lights stretching out beyond the glass like something distant and unreachable, and for a second I let myself breathe, slow, steady, trying to ground myself in something real, something outside of this room, but even that felt fragile, like it could disappear the moment I turned back. You should not stay, a voice whispered beside me, low, careful, and I turned to see another server, older, her expression tight with something close to warning, and she did not look directly at me when she spoke again. When he notices someone, it does not end quickly. I felt the words settle in my chest, heavy, but I shook my head slightly, keeping my voice quiet. I just need to finish my shift, because leaving was not simple, not for me, not for someone who could not afford to walk away from even one night's pay. She looked at me then, really looked, like she wanted to say more, but knew it would not matter, and after a second she just nodded and moved away, disappearing back into the flow of the room like she had never been there at all. I stood there for a moment longer, the weight of her words pressing in, but I forced myself to move again, to keep going, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant realizing how little control I actually had. As I turned, my eyes lifted without permission this time, drawn by something I could not name, and across the room, near the center where the light fell softer and the shadows stretched longer, I saw him. Again, he was not speaking, not moving much, just standing there with a glass in his hand, but the space around him felt carved out, defined by his presence, and his eyes were already on me, like they had never left. The distance between us felt smaller than it should have been, like the room itself had folded in on that invisible line connecting us, and for a second, everything else faded again. The music, the voices, the movement, all of it dissolving into something distant and unimportant. He did not signal, did not call me over, did not need to, because the moment our eyes met, something settled, something unspoken but clear, and I understood with a certainty that made my pulse spike all over again. He had given me time, not freedom, not a choice, time. And whatever came after that was not something I could walk away from as easily as I had hoped. I counted the minutes without looking at the clock because time felt different now, stretched thin and pulled tight at the same time. Every second louder than it should have been, every movement measured as if something unseen was keeping track. And I told myself it would end the moment my shift ended, that I would walk out, take the subway home, disappear back into the version of my life that did not include him. But even that thought felt fragile, like something that could break the moment I believed in it too much. I kept moving, tray after tray, table after table, my body remembering the rhythm even when my mind refused to settle, and every so often I felt it again, that quiet pressure at my back, not touch, never touch, just presence, controlled and deliberate, like he was giving me space while never truly letting me leave it. The room had started to thin out, the music softer now, conversations winding down into quieter tones, and the golden light that had once felt distant now seemed dimmer, like the night itself was closing in around the edges, and with every passing minute, the awareness in my chest grew sharper, clearer, harder to ignore. When I returned to the service station, my manager was waiting, his expression tight, careful, like he had rehearsed what he was about to say, but still was not sure how it would land. "Lily," he said quietly, not meeting my eyes right away, "you can clock out early tonight." The words should have felt like relief, simple, straightforward, exactly what I needed, but something in the way he said it made my stomach drop, because this was not a favor, not really. "I still have tables," I replied, keeping my voice steady. But he shook his head immediately, too quickly, like the answer had already been decided before I asked the question. "They are covered," he said, finally looking at me, and there was something in his expression I had never seen before, something close to unease. "You are done." I held his gaze for a second longer, searching for something more, some explanation, some reason that made sense in a world that still followed rules I understood, but there was nothing there except that same quiet tension I had been feeling all night, and slowly, without saying anything else, I nodded. I moved toward the back hallway, the noise of the room fading behind me with each step, replaced by the softer hum of fluorescent lights and the distant echo of voices that no longer felt connected to me. And for a moment, I let myself breathe, just one steady breath, because this was it. This was my chance to leave before whatever line I had stepped into closed completely around me. I grabbed my bag from the locker, my fingers moving faster now, urgency slipping in despite everything I had told myself, and I pushed open the side exit door, stepping out into the cool night air that felt sharp against my skin, real in a way nothing inside had been. The city stretched out in front of me, streetlights glowing, cars passing, distant horns blending into the familiar rhythm of a place that never stopped moving, and for a second, I almost believed I had made it, that I could just walk away, blend into the crowd, let this night become something distant and unreal. Then I heard it, not loud, not sudden, just the quiet sound of a car door closing somewhere behind me, precise, controlled, and my steps slowed before I could stop them. I did not turn right away, I did not want to, because something deep inside me already knew what I would see, but the silence behind me pressed in, heavier with every second, until I had no choice. When I finally turned, he was there, standing a few feet away beneath the dim streetlight, his expression unreadable, his presence just as undeniable outside as it had been inside, And in that moment, I understood something that made my pulse spike all over again. He had not let me leave. He had only let me think I could. For a moment, I did not move because the distance between us felt smaller than it should have been, like the air itself had folded to bring him closer, and the city around us kept moving, cars passing, lights changing, people walking by without noticing anything unusual, but none of it felt real anymore, not with him standing there like he had been waiting all along. I tightened my grip on my bag, grounding myself in something solid, something that still belonged to me, and forced my voice to stay steady when I said, "You should not be here." It sounded weak the second it left my mouth because even I did not believe it, not when everything about him suggested he could be anywhere he chose to be. He did not respond right away, just watched me with that same quiet focus, as if my words were something to consider rather than dismiss. And then he took one slow step closer, not threatening, not rushed, just enough to remind me that the space between us was never really mine to control. "You left," he said, and there was no accusation in it, no anger, just a simple statement that somehow carried more weight than if he had raised his voice. I swallowed, my pulse steady but loud, and nodded once because denying it would have been pointless. "My shift ended," I replied, holding his gaze even though something in me wanted to look away, to break whatever connection had formed between us. His eyes moved slightly, taking in the street, the building behind me, the direction I had been heading, like he was mapping out something I could not see, and then they returned to me, sharper now, more certain. "I told you not to leave," he said, and that quiet authority slipped back into his tone, the same one that had pulled me across the room earlier, but this time I felt it differently. Not just as command, but as expectation, like he had already decided how this would go. I shook my head slightly, more out of instinct than defiance, and said, "You do not get to decide that," because it was the only truth I could hold on to, the only line I could draw even if it was invisible. Something shifted in his expression then, subtle but real, like I had said something that did not fit into the pattern he was used to, and for a second, the silence between us stretched again, thinner now, sharper, until he exhaled slowly and looked away for the briefest moment, as if recalibrating. When he looked back, there was something different in his eyes, not softer, not weaker, just more controlled, like he had chosen restraint over something else. "You are right," he said quietly, and the words caught me off guard because they did not match what I expected. "I do not decide what you do." The admission hung there, unexpected, almost disarming, but before I could respond, he continued, his voice just as calm, just as steady. "But I decide what happens around you." The meaning settled slowly, heavy and clear, and I felt my chest tighten as I understood what he was saying without him needing to explain it further. I looked past him for a second, noticing now what I had missed before, a dark car parked along the curb, another figure standing a few feet away pretending not to watch, the subtle shift of the environment that said this was not just chance, not just coincidence. I drew in a slow breath, forcing myself to stay grounded, and met his gaze again. "Why?" I asked, the words simple but loaded with everything I did not understand, and for the first time since this began, something flickered across his face that I could not fully read. Not power, not control, something closer to conflict, like the answer was not as simple as the situation itself. He studied me for a long second, then two, then spoke in a voice lower than before, almost like he was saying it more to himself than to me. "Because you are not afraid," he said, and the words landed heavier than anything else he had said so far, because they felt wrong and true at the same time. I let out a quiet breath, shaking my head slightly, and answered honestly, "I am, because I was, in ways I did not fully understand yet." His gaze did not waver, but something in it shifted again, deeper this time, more focused, and he took another step closer, stopping just within reach without crossing that final line. "No," he said softly, "you are careful." And somehow, that felt more dangerous than anything else he could have called me. The word careful stayed between us longer than it should have, settling into the quiet space like something that had always been there, something he had simply chosen to name, and I felt it in the way my shoulders held still, in the way my breath slowed just enough to think clearly, because careful was not the same as weak, and something told me he understood that better than anyone. I shifted my weight slightly, grounding myself on the uneven edge of the sidewalk, the cool night air brushing against my skin as cars passed behind him, headlights flashing briefly across his face, catching the sharp lines of his expression before disappearing again, and in those flickers of light and shadow, he looked less like a man and more like something carved out of control itself. "You are still standing here," he said after a moment, his voice quiet but precise, as if he was noting a fact rather than asking a question, and I realized he was right. I had not walked away, not yet, even though every part of me knew I should. "So are you," I replied, and the words came out steadier than I expected, carrying a hint of something I could not quite name, not defiance exactly, but not submission either, something in between that seemed to catch his attention in a different way. His gaze sharpened slightly, not in anger, but in focus, like he was adjusting to a new variable, and for a second, neither of us moved, the space between us holding that same tension, that same unspoken pull that had followed me since the moment our eyes met inside. "Where were you going?" he asked, and this time it was a question, real and deliberate, and it caught me off guard more than any command could have, because it felt almost normal, almost human, like something someone else might ask on any other night. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, then answered honestly, "Home," because there was no reason to lie about something so simple, even if nothing about this situation was simple anymore. He nodded once, slowly, like he had expected that answer, like it confirmed something he had already decided, and then his eyes moved briefly past me, down the street, taking in the direction I had been heading, before returning to mine. "Then I will take you," he said, and the words were calm, almost casual, but they carried that same underlying certainty that made it impossible to ignore what he meant by them. I felt my grip tighten on my bag again, instinct rising quickly now, sharper than before, and I shook my head without thinking. "No," I said, the word coming faster this time, stronger, because this line felt clearer than the others, more solid, something I could not let blur. His expression did not change, not immediately, but something in his eyes shifted again, not frustration, not irritation, something closer to interest, like the repetition of that word had become something worth paying attention to. "You refuse everything," he said quietly, almost like an observation meant only for himself, and I felt a small, unexpected spark of something steady in my chest at that, because it was not entirely true, but it was close enough to matter. "I choose," I corrected, meeting his gaze directly, and for a second, the world seemed to pause again, the noise of the city fading into the background as that single word settled between us. "Choose." It felt small when I said it, but in that moment, it felt like the only thing I had left. He watched me carefully, more carefully than before, as if the word itself had shifted something in the way he saw me, and then, slowly, he stepped back, not retreating, not giving up, just creating space where there had been none. "Then choose," he said, his voice lower now, steadier. "But understand something, Lily." The way he said my name again made my pulse jump despite everything, like it carried weight I did not understand, and I held still, waiting without meaning to. "Whatever you choose," he continued, his eyes never leaving mine, "it does not end tonight." The words landed softly, but they did not feel soft, they felt certain, like something already set in motion, something neither of us could fully see yet. And in that moment, standing under the dim streetlight with the city moving around us like nothing had changed, I realized he was not trying to stop me from leaving anymore. He was telling me that leaving would not matter. His words did not follow me. They stayed with me, settling somewhere deeper than I wanted them to, because it was not a threat, not exactly. It was something quieter, something that felt already decided, and that was what made it harder to ignore. I did not answer him right away because I did not trust my voice to sound steady. And for a moment we just stood there, the distance he had given me still hanging between us, fragile but real, like a line drawn in air that could disappear the second either of us stepped forward. A car passed behind him, headlights sweeping across the street and catching in his eyes for a split second, turning them into something almost reflective, something that made it impossible to tell what he was thinking, and I realized that was the point. He did not need to show anything, not when everything around him already moved in his favor. I tightened my grip on my bag again, grounding myself, reminding myself that I was still in control of one thing, my next step, and slowly, deliberately, I shifted my weight and stepped back. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but it mattered because it was mine. He did not stop me. He did not move. He just watched, and that somehow made it harder because it meant this was not about force, not about being trapped in the way I understood. It was something else, something that made leaving feel less like escape and more like stepping into something unknown. I turned then, before I could second-guess it, before I could let the weight of his presence pull me back again, and started walking down the street, my steps steady at first, measured, controlled, like I could outrun the feeling if I just kept moving. The city welcomed me back immediately, noise filling the silence. Engines humming, voices overlapping, the familiar rhythm of a place that never paused for anyone, and I let it wash over me, trying to blend into it, trying to disappear into something bigger than this moment. I did not look back. I told myself not to, because if I looked, I would slow down, and if I slowed down, I might stop, and I did not know what would happen if I stopped. The block stretched ahead of me, then another, the distance growing, the space between us widening in a way that should have felt like relief, but did not entirely, because something in my chest stayed tight, like a thread had been pulled too far and had not snapped yet. I reached the corner and paused just long enough to check the traffic light, red glowing above me, cars slowing, people gathering at the edge of the crosswalk, and for a second, I let myself breathe, just one steady inhale, one controlled exhale, telling myself that this was normal, that this was my life, that whatever had happened back there could stay there. Then I felt it again. Not a sound, not a touch, just that same awareness, that same quiet certainty that I was not as alone as the street made it seem. I did not turn immediately, but my shoulders tightened slightly, my breath catching just enough to betray me. And when the light shifted to green and the crowd began to move, I stepped forward with them, letting the flow carry me across the street. Halfway through, I gave in to the instinct I had been fighting and glanced back, just for a second, just long enough to confirm what I already knew. He was not where I had left him. The spot under the streetlight was empty now, the space already reclaimed by shadows and passing headlights, like he had never been there at all, and for a brief moment, something close to relief flickered through me. Then I saw it. Across the intersection, on the opposite side, just beyond the line of people, he stood again, still, watching, as if distance meant nothing, as if the city itself rearranged around him without resistance. And in that instant, as the crowd moved and the light changed and the night continued like nothing had shifted, I understood something that made my pulse spike all over again. He had not followed me. He had anticipated me. The moment I saw him across the intersection, something inside me stilled instead of panicked, like my body had already begun to understand a rule my mind was still trying to catch up to. And that realization felt heavier than fear because it meant this was not random, not coincidence, not something I could outpace just by moving faster. The crowd carried me forward, people brushing past my shoulders, footsteps overlapping in a steady rhythm, but none of it reached me the way it should have, not with his presence cutting through everything else like a fixed point in motion. I forced myself to keep walking, not stopping, not hesitating, because stopping meant acknowledging what was happening, and I was not ready to do that yet. My apartment was 3 blocks away, a distance I had walked 100 times without thinking, but tonight each step felt measured, intentional, like I was tracing a path that had already been drawn for me. I turned left at the corner without looking back again, not because I did not want to, but because I already knew what I would see, and knowing was somehow worse than confirming. The street grew quieter as I moved farther from the main road, the noise of traffic fading into something distant, replaced by the softer hum of streetlights and the occasional passing car. And for a moment, the normalcy of it all tried to settle over me again, tried to convince me that this could still end in something simple. Then I heard it, the low, steady roll of a car engine moving at the same pace as my steps, not rushing, not overtaking, just there, present in the background like a shadow that chose to stay. I did not look at it right away, but I did not need to, because I could feel it in the way my shoulders tightened slightly, in the way my breath slowed as I focused on keeping my pace even. After a few seconds, I let my gaze shift just enough to catch the reflection in a storefront window, and there it was, a dark car moving along the curb, matching me step for step, not close enough to block me, not far enough to ignore. My pulse picked up again, sharper this time, not from surprise, but from confirmation, and I kept walking, refusing to give it more than that glance, because reacting would only make it real in a way I could not control. 1 block, then another, the distance to my building shrinking with each step, and I told myself that once I reached the door, once I stepped inside, this would end, or at least pause long enough for me to think, to understand what I was supposed to do next. I reached into my bag, my fingers brushing against my keys, grounding myself in something familiar, something that belonged to my life before this night, and I focused on that feeling, on the simple act of getting home. When I finally reached the front of my building, the old brick facade looked exactly the same as it always had, worn but steady, a place that had never changed for anyone, and for a brief second, relief flickered through me, small but real. I stepped up to the door, pulled my keys free, and unlocked it quickly. The metal clicked louder than it should have been in the quiet street, and as I pushed it open, I felt that same awareness again, stronger now, closer. I paused, just for a fraction of a second, and turned my head slightly, enough to see the reflection in the glass panel beside the door. The car had stopped. The engine was still running. And across the street, standing beside it now instead of inside, he watched me again, just as still, just as certain, like distance had never mattered in the first place. My hand tightened around the door handle, my pulse loud in my ears, and for a moment, I hesitated, caught between stepping inside and closing the door or turning back to face whatever this had become. Because in that quiet space between movement and decision, one thought settled in with absolute clarity. He was not trying to reach me anymore. He was making sure I understood that he already could. The door was half open in my hand when I stopped, not because I could not move, but because something inside me refused to pretend this was normal anymore, and the quiet hum of the building behind me suddenly felt too distant, too safe for a moment that was anything but. The glass panel beside the door reflected more than just the streetlight now. It held his silhouette across the road, still, unwavering, as if he had been there long before I arrived and would remain long after I left, and that realization pressed in heavier than anything else that had happened tonight. I could walk inside. I could close the door. I could lock it and pretend that distance meant protection, but something told me that would not change what had already been set in motion. My fingers tightened slightly around the handle, the cool metal grounding me for a second, and I exhaled slowly, steadying myself before I turned. Not fully, just enough. Enough to face him without stepping away from my own door. The street between us felt wider now, quieter, the passing cars fewer, the noise of the city dimmed into something that no longer distracted from the fact that he was still there, watching, waiting without urgency, like time belonged to him in a way it never had to me. "You should go," I said, my voice carrying across the distance more clearly than I expected, not raised, not sharp, just firm, and for a second, nothing changed. He did not move. He did not look away. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something unspoken, something that made the air feel heavier than it should have been. Then, slowly, he stepped off the curb and crossed the street. Not rushed, not hesitant. Each step measured, deliberate, as if the space between us was not an obstacle but a choice he was making in real time. I stayed where I was, my back straight, my hand still on the door, because stepping inside now would feel like retreat, and something in me resisted that more than anything else. When he reached the sidewalk in front of me, he stopped a few feet away, the same distance he had kept before, close enough to feel his presence, far enough to leave a line uncrossed. Up close, the quiet control in him felt sharper, more defined, like the absence of chaos was its own kind of force, and his eyes held mine with that same steady focus that had followed me since the beginning of the night. "You hesitate," he said, not as an accusation, not even as a question, just an observation, and I realized he was right, not about fear, but about something else, something more complicated. "I am thinking," I replied, because that was the only truth that made sense, and for a moment, something in his expression shifted again, subtle but real, like he recognized that difference. He glanced briefly at the building behind me, at the door still open, then back at me, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, lower, carrying something beneath the control that had not been there before. "You think a door changes this," he said, and the words settled in a way that made it clear he was not speaking about the building anymore. I felt my breath catch slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what he meant, and I shook my head once, slow, deliberate. No, I said, because I understood that much now, that this was not about distance or walls or anything as simple as leaving or staying. His gaze held mine for a long second, then another, and in that silence, something shifted again, something quieter, deeper, like a line moving just beneath the surface. Good, he said finally, and there was something almost final in the way he said it, like a conclusion had been reached without needing to be spoken out loud. The night stretched around us, still, waiting, and I realized then that this was not a moment that would end with a single decision. Not tonight. Not with something this deliberate, this controlled. My hand tightened once more on the door, the edge of it pressing lightly against my shoulder, and I held his gaze without stepping back. Because in that narrow space between leaving and staying, one truth had become impossible to ignore. This was no longer about whether I could walk away. It was about what walking away would actually mean. The word good did not feel like approval. It felt like confirmation, like something he had been waiting to hear without needing to ask for it directly, and the quiet certainty in his voice settled deeper than I wanted it to, because it meant he understood something about this moment that I was still trying to define. I stood there with the door half open behind me, the dim hallway light spilling out just enough to outline the edge of my space, and for a second, I considered stepping inside anyway, closing it, ending this conversation on my terms, but something held me in place. Not fear, not hesitation, something closer to awareness, like leaving now would not actually be leaving at all. He did not move closer, and that restraint felt intentional, like he was choosing not to cross a line that he clearly could, and that choice made everything more complicated than if he had simply forced the moment forward. You are still deciding, he said after a second, his voice low, steady, and I realized he was not rushing me, not pushing, just observing the process like it was something worth studying. I exhaled slowly, keeping my eyes on him, and answered honestly, yes, because there was no reason to pretend otherwise, not with someone who seemed to read everything I did not say as easily as what I did. His gaze held mine, unwavering, and for a moment, the quiet between us felt almost balanced, like we were both standing on the same line without either of us stepping past it. Then he shifted slightly, not forward, not back, just enough to change the angle of his stance, and his eyes moved briefly to my hand still gripping the door before returning to my face. You think staying inside will make this simpler, he said, and it was not a question, but it still made something tighten in my chest because it was too close to the truth. I shook my head once, slower this time, and said, I think it will give me time, because that was the only thing I could name, the only thing I felt slipping through my hands the longer I stood here. He studied me for a second, then nodded once, like he accepted that answer even if he did not fully agree with it. Time changes nothing, he said quietly, and the words landed with a weight that felt practiced, like he had learned that lesson long before tonight, long before me. I held his gaze, feeling the meaning of that settle in, and for a moment, I almost asked him what he meant, almost stepped into that conversation, but something stopped me. Something instinctive that told me once I started asking questions, I would not be able to step back again. The silence stretched again, but it felt different now, less sharp, more deliberate, like we were both aware that whatever came next would matter in a way neither of us could fully undo. I shifted my weight slightly, the edge of the door brushing against my shoulder, and said, Then why are you still here? Because that question had been building since the moment I saw him again across the street. Because none of this made sense without an answer to that. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes deepened, something quieter, more focused, and when he spoke, his voice carried a different kind of weight, not command, not control, something closer to intention. Because you did not leave, he said, and for a second, I did not understand, not fully, because I had walked away, I had crossed the street, I had come all the way here, but then I felt it. The meaning behind his words, the difference between distance and departure, the space between movement and decision. I stood there, the night pressing in around us, the city still moving beyond this narrow moment, and realized that he was right in a way I had not wanted to admit. I had not left. Not really. And somehow, that mattered more than anything else that had happened tonight. The truth of it settled slowly, not like a realization, but like something that had been there all along, waiting for me to stop pretending I did not see it. And the weight of his words pressed deeper the longer I stood there without moving, because he was right in a way that left no room for easy denial. I had walked away, but I had not left. Not from him. Not from whatever this was becoming. The night air felt colder now, sharper against my skin, and I became aware of how still everything between us had become, like the city had pulled back just enough to leave this moment untouched. My hand loosened slightly on the door handle, the tension in my fingers easing not from comfort, but from something else, something closer to acceptance, and I let out a slow breath I had not realized I was holding. "Then what do you want?" I asked, the question quieter than before, not because I was afraid, but because I needed to hear the answer without anything else covering it. He did not respond immediately, and for a second, I wondered if he would not answer at all, if this was one of those moments where silence carried more weight than words. But then he took a small step forward, not enough to close the distance completely, just enough to make the space between us feel intentional again. "I want you to understand," he said, his voice low, controlled, but different now, like there was something beneath it that he was choosing not to hide entirely. I felt my brow tighten slightly, not in confusion, but in focus, because understanding what exactly was the part he had not said yet, and something told me that part mattered more than anything else. "Understand what?" I asked, holding his gaze, refusing to let the moment drift into something vague or undefined. His eyes did not leave mine, and for a second, something in them shifted again, deeper this time, more exposed, like a layer of control had been pulled back just enough to reveal what was underneath. "That this is not chance," he said, each word deliberate, measured, like he was placing them carefully where they could not be misunderstood, "and it is not temporary." The meaning of that settled heavier than anything else he had said so far, because it did not sound like a possibility, it sounded like a certainty, like something already decided long before tonight ever began. I felt my pulse pick up again, not from fear alone, but from the weight of what he was asking me to accept, and I shook my head slightly, more instinct than refusal. "You do not know me," I said, because that felt like the only argument that still made sense, the only thing that could separate this moment from something inevitable. For the first time since this started, something close to a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his expression, not warm, not soft, but real enough to shift the air between us. "I know enough," he replied, and the quiet confidence in his voice made something tighten in my chest again, because it did not sound like guesswork, it sounded like certainty built on something I could not see. I held his gaze, searching for something more, some explanation, some reason that made this make sense in a world that still followed rules I understood, but all I found was that same steady focus, that same unshaken presence that had followed me from the moment he first saw me. The silence stretched again, but this time it did not feel uncertain. It felt like a line being drawn, something final settling into place without needing to be said out loud. I glanced briefly at the open door behind me, at the quiet hallway waiting just a few steps away, then back at him. And in that moment, I understood something I had been avoiding since the beginning of this night. This was not about whether I could walk away. It was about whether I was willing to pretend this meant nothing. And standing there, caught between the life I knew and the presence I could not ignore, I realized I was already past that point. The realization did not arrive like a sudden shock. It unfolded slowly, settling into the quiet space between us until it became impossible to ignore, and I felt it in the way my grip on the door finally loosened, in the way my shoulders eased just slightly, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. He had not asked me to step closer. He had not reached for me. He had only stood there, steady and certain, and somehow that made everything harder to resist because it meant this was not about force, it was about choice, and that was the one thing I could not pretend away anymore. I took a slow breath, letting the cool night air fill my lungs, grounding myself in something real before I spoke again, because whatever I said next would not just end this moment, it would define what came after it. "You think this means something," I said, my voice quiet but clear, and it was not a question, not exactly, more like a line I was drawing out loud, something I needed him to hear as much as I needed to hear it myself. His gaze did not shift, did not soften, but there was something in it now that felt more focused, more deliberate, like he had been waiting for me to reach this point. "It does," he answered simply, and there was no hesitation in it, no uncertainty, just the same quiet certainty that had followed me since the beginning of the night. I shook my head slightly, not in denial, but in disbelief, because nothing about this made sense in the world I understood, nothing about this fit into the life I had built piece by piece, and yet standing here, looking at him, I could not pretend it meant nothing either. "You do not know what you are asking," I said, and this time there was something sharper in my voice, not fear, not anger, something closer to truth, because whatever this was, it was not simple, and it was not something that could be decided in a single moment on a quiet street. For the first time, he stepped closer without stopping halfway, closing the distance just enough that the space between us no longer felt like a barrier, but a boundary waiting to be crossed, and I felt my breath catch before I could stop it, not because he touched me, but because he did not. He stopped just short of reaching, just short of crossing that final line, and that restraint carried more weight than any action could have. "I am not asking," he said quietly, and the words should have felt like a command, but they did not entirely, because there was something else in them now, something that sounded less like control and more like certainty, like he was stating something that already existed rather than trying to create it. The silence that followed was different this time, not tense, not uncertain, but full, like something had settled into place without either of us needing to push it there. I held his gaze, feeling the weight of everything unsaid pressing in around us, and for a moment, the world narrowed down to just this, just the space between us, just the choice that no longer felt like a simple decision. Behind me, the door remained open, the quiet hallway waiting, offering a version of safety that suddenly felt smaller than it had a few minutes ago, and in front of me, he stood exactly where he had chosen to be, not forcing, not retreating, simply there, undeniable. I let out a slow breath, my fingers finally slipping from the door handle as I stepped forward, not far, just enough to close the space he had left, just enough to make my decision visible without needing to say it out loud. His eyes did not change, but something in the air did, something subtle but real, like a shift that had been waiting for this exact moment to happen. And as I stood there, no longer between leaving and staying, but fully inside the choice I had made, one truth settled in with quiet certainty. He had not taken anything from me. I had stepped into it on my own.